Well, I think we're going to get started. And if I have not shouted you out, I just want to give you a warm welcome on behalf of Fathers Incorporated. My name is Lawrence Wilbin. I'm the Director for Business and Program Development. And it is an honor to have you all a part of this webinar. Now, let me just tell you, you're going to in for a treat on this morning. We have individuals that serve on an advisory capacity with our Monahan Institute for Fatherhood Research and Policy. But we also, these individuals are not just a part of that advisory thing, but they are subject matter experts in their field. And so we are excited to have them a part of this discussion on today. And so you might just want to make sure that you know that you're in the right place, but this is the impact of current media portrayals of Black fathers. And I extended a welcome, but I also wanted to again shout out and extend a welcome on behalf of our Chief Executive Officer, Kenneth Braswell, who's actually on the line with us as well. For those who are not familiar with Fathers Incorporated is an organization that it is about changing the narrative around this whole idea of responsible fatherhood. And so we've actually been doing this work for nearly 16 years. And so we are entrenched in community, entrenched in the work. And this is an opportunity as part of our platform to be able to express and to be able to share and to help change that narrative around the narrative that's out there around fatherhood. And so I am honored today to serve as the engineer, I guess I'll call myself, because the moderator of this presentation will be Dr. Janice Kelly. Then we actually have Dr. Jl Adolf and then Dr. Amon Perry. So if you'll give me a few minutes, I'll go ahead and give you their bios, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation. Before I do that, make sure you use the chat. The chat is going to be our friend today. If there are things that are said that agree with you, I want you to make sure you put things within the chat to show your support. If it doesn't agree, just put it in the chat. Also, there's a Q&A portion that will happen during the session. If there are some burning questions that you want to ask the panelists today, the presenters today, please put it within the Q&A section as well, so that we can go ahead and address that. I will say that during the presentation, you'll hear my voice come in and maybe ask a couple questions just to kind of feel the pulse of the room as we're going along with the presentation. Again, we're going to get started because we want to make sure that we respect everyone's time. Again, thank you to everyone that's joining us for this webinar. So let me tell you who we have that will be sharing with us on today. So today we have Dr. Janice Kelly. Dr. Janice Kelly is a full professor and the communications department chair at Mallow College, New York. I probably messed that name up. Sorry about that, Dr. Kelly. She is a licensed certified family life educator. Her research and scholarship span from family communication, fatherhood, and popular culture, gender, leadership, and intergenerational communication in the workplace. She served as a guest editor for the journal Fathering, Theory, Research, and Practice about men as fathers. Her research on a comparison of primetime situation comedy fathers and real fathers on involvement, communication, and infection has appeared in USA Today, Big Apple Parenting Magazine, and other national publications. She is a proud board member of Fathers Incorporated, an advisory board member of the Monahan Institute for Fatherhood Research and Policy. She co-produced, along with Kenneth Braswell, a documentary on perceptions of fathers in the media in search of the ideal father. She has been interviewed on several radio programs and newspapers on the following topics: television images of fathers in the media, conflict and communication, developing professional communication skills, and gender and different leadership styles. She co-authored the book Deconstructing Dad, Changing Images of Fathers in a Popular Culture. So that's Dr. Janice. Thank you for joining us on today. Dr. Jl Adolf. In 2018, Dr. Adolf completed his PhD in English, African Diaspora Studies at the University of Missouri, Columbia. His dissertation centered on fatherhood narratives in hip hop lyricism. He received an MA, Master's from the University of Missouri, Columbia in 2009, and a bachelor's in English with a minor in Africana Studies from Central Missouri State University in May of 2005. Dr. Adolf has a professional background in utilizing hip hop culture as a tool to teach at promise youth and families with histories of trauma successfully. The English professor employs innovative communication methods in furnishing an educational space to discuss urban male parenting in contemporary America. His keynote speeches and interactive online series, Dad Cipher, a hip hop guide for fatherhood challenges, critiques skepticism of hip hop culture and the mythology of African American fatherhood. As a media literacy specialist and research, Adolf utilizes his expertise to empower inner city and marginalized dads. Hence, his works seek to alter or remix the mainstream narrative of African American father. Thank you, Dr. Adolf, for joining us. And last but not least, we have Dr. Amon Perry, who is a professor and director of the BSW program at the University of Louisville's Kent School of Social Work. Dr. Perry teaches Introduction to Social Work. Dr. Perry's research interest includes fathers' involvement in the lives of their children, leading him to co-edit Fatherhood in America, Social Work Perspective, in Changing Society, a comprehensive edited volume addressing the micro and macro factors shaping parental involvement. His newest project, Black Love Matters, authentic men's voices of marriages and romantic relationship. You can actually purchase a copy of the book, and he'll probably share a little bit about that during his presentation. But I did want to just highlight today at 12 p.m. on the Fathers Incorporated Facebook page, there will be a lively discussion around this whole idea of Black Love Matters with Dr. Perry. He'll be joining that discussion immediately after this webinar. So I want to welcome our entire panelists to the webinar, and we look forward to hearing what you have. At this time, we're going to turn it over into the hands of Dr. Janice Kelly. Thank you so much.
Good morning all, and thank you. Are you going to put up the slides? Okay, thank you. So I want to thank you and thank the Fatherhood Incorporated for inviting me today to participate in this very meaningful and I think needed discussion about the role of the media and the power of the media. We know over the years there's been so many articles and journals talking about subconscious mind and the subliminal messages, but I'm glad that we are now focusing and narrowing our discussion on the portrayals of Black fathers. You'll hear me also talk about Black masculinity and the role, a historical perspective to open with, looking at the role of media and how it shaped us before we even had a voice on the script, the writing, and the portrayals of Black family, Black community, and Black life. So let me begin. My quick discussion and intro is media images without a narrative about Black fathers and Black family life. You can go to the next slide. And the reason why I focused on The Birth of the Nation is that this was produced in 1915, and this was the first silent drama directed by D.W. Griffith, and it was considered a landmark film amongst film historians because of its use of cinematic techniques like close-ups, fade out, the length of a film. I have to say this, even today in some colleges, this Birth of the Nation, the 1915 version, not the 2016, is still used in film classes to talk about the techniques of it, but they don't mention the poisonous portrayals of Black masculinity throughout the film. And so the reason why I looked at the Birth of the Nation is because it goes back to my topic. It was the first time that we distributed the poisonous images of Black males. And this didn't just go national, this also went global. And it really has, and I think it still does, a profound impact on how people are perceived. Even when Nate Parker tried to correct the harmful images of the original film, he tried to look at it from the contemporary standpoint of during slavery and how Black men rescued, loved, sacrificed, protected family. I give him kudos for doing that. And taking the name of Birth of a Nation and trying to revise it. But the image of 100 years of this film has done its duty in terms of creating a poisonous legacy of how people are perceived. And so the problem or the challenge for many of us who study the media is how do we undo 100 years of toxic portrayals? And that's really the challenge for many of us. And so you can go to the next slide. Thank you. And so we continue with these toxic images of Black men, of Black women who are found in print images, whether it's in newspapers, whether it's cartoons, or in literature, whether it is pre or post slavery. For many, for over 100 years, the image of Black father, Black family life, Black masculinity, Black women have been the script of those who don't live with us, don't know us, and would rather keep us as buffoons than actual real people. And these kinds of portrayals have been very toxic to going into what Dr. Perry is going to talk about: Black love, Black support, Black family life. And so we've had 100 years of these images that have been globally, again, distributed and had an impact on our true sense of self. You can go to the next slide as well. And you can see these images again. If anyone knows, I think it's Childish Gambino in his America video does a playoff on the Jim Crow character. And what he was trying to show is just, again, how America tries to box in, limited, poison our sense of self, our sense of integrity, and particularly for Black men, to marginalize them in terms of not having them fully human in the media representation. And so frequently these images that have been toxic even leaked out into our portrayal of family life and images into the 1940s and 50s. You can go to the next slide. These frequent images in movies, in TV shows that portrayed Black men too often as either buffoons, incarcerated, hypersexual, violent, uneducated men, second-class characters to support the main characters like a Jack Benny, a Charlie Chan, and the like of that. And always to be the laughing character, the one that brings and delivers the humor, but not the moral or the ethical sense of self in many of these shows. And so they, meaning they, Black men have been pigeonholed into, during the 1940s and 50s, to represent the laugh track, but not to represent the dignity, the respect, the challenges of their lives that could be portrayed in many of these shows. Next slide, please. And so you get Amos and Andy, where the audience laughs each night when they were on television. You had Rochester not being taken seriously. And so for some, Black fathers were shown that they could not manage money, They could not manage their families. They could not manage their wives, their mothers, women. And so this fluidity and frequency of not being able to manage life itself, unless you are laughing at them, became part of the norm of the 50s, the 40s, 50s, and a little bit of the early 60s. Next slide. But something happened in the 60s and the 70s. And, there's a lot of argument about pre and post civil rights era. But during the 1960s and 70s, Hollywood realized that they had to move away from that minstrel characterization of the Black man and the Black community. And so they started to develop some form of shows that showed Black fathers and Black men in a more, if you want to say, serious portrayal, taking on the security of their families, taking on the survival of their families, talking about the future, as James Evan always talks to Michael about going to college, talking to his daughter about the future, and James, JJ, and strengthening his love for art. You see now a dialogue brewing. Now, some might position James Evans as a complicated character, because, here comes this character that, complains and argues about day-to-day existence of life living in a public housing facility. But what we do get a little bit from James Evans is a discussion that we don't see today about father's rage, father's pain, father's hardship. And particularly, and I said this before in one of our webinars, about the working class father. Hollywood has just marginalized the voice, the image of Black fathers. And part of that, and someone can argue, is because you limit their narrative, their dialogue, their image, because you don't know them. And so what Hollywood has decided to do overall to deal with not knowing, not feeling the pain and actually having truth in the dialogue is by the 70s and 80s, excuse me, the 90s and 200s, is make most Black family TV shows all middle class. Because once you did that, once you made all these TV shows, Black TV shows, middle class, is that you kind of erased any of the pain, the rage, the difficulty, the struggle for employment, struggle in relationships. You erase all the true dialogue. And so that's what Hollywood was trying to do. Now, someone can still say that during also the 60s and 70s, when we were getting more and more films, as Bell Hooks would say, the image of coolness and hypermasculinity was coming about. And so you had more and more of these shows showing the cool factor. And we know that economically that the dominant culture was commodifying and making money off of our coolness. And we still see that today. But there's no true deep dialogue. I will section out Blackness, because I do think that they try to have those serious conversations as an upper middle class family, but overall there's still a gap. And so Hollywood still does not know how to take us, how to position us, how to have true dialogue about who we are. And you can see that over and over again. And so here it goes again, that we see characters that are marginalized even in the media. I once said that what is also happening, and I think in an article that I was reading from Brooms and Perry, is this thing called invisible syndrome, right? That Hollywood makes it invisible to really show Black fathers, Black men, and for the most part, even Black women, our true talents, our personality, our worth, and not value our sense of self, because most of these shows still deal with the design and the creation of racism. And because of that, there is an emptiness when we watch some of these shows. This is why there's no surprise of the meaningfulness of shows like Black Panther, Get Out, Luke Cage, When there's a writing, when people who write represent the life, the experience, and the image, it is a deeper dialogue, a stronger dialogue, and an affirmation for some of what they are seeing. And so there is a real serious fight to see true images on television even today. I just want to stay with James Evans just one more time. I think what makes James Evans stand out even today after the 70s, when his show was originally on television, is that James Evans' character is really rooted an Afrocentric ideology of what it means to be a man. We see that he is frustrated at times, that the family eats oatmeal all the time. Um, but his connection to his family was not about being the breadwinner. His connection to his family was about his masculinity, his sense of family, his spirituality, and his commitment to his community. Those were the things that made him come home every night. Those were the things that connected this family as a unit, away from the European definition of masculinity, which is equal to economics, right? And so I believe that my colleagues today will go deeper in an analysis of the portrayal of fathers in hip hop and mass media. But I want us to also just insert what we've been watching in the last 5 years, which was fathers in print media. You can go to the next slide. Mhm. Now, these are print ads, and you'll see the next one in a few minutes, that have been around less than 5 years. And this is where I think the voice of Fatherhood Incorporated and others have to have the fight of the fight, because this is probably people who have designed and created these print ads who probably read the Moynihan report and felt very comfortable removing fathers from this print ad. If you see this ad, you will see that everyone has, even if it's the same partner family, everyone has either a mother, father, or two adult partners. Unless you're looking at the bottom right to your left, and there's a woman who has now, if you really look at it, three African American boys, and she's a single mother. And without a notion, when Macy's put this, printed this as an ad, did not even think about adding a father to this print ad. It took the voices of many to push back and call out Macy's about this particular ad. And why they felt comfortable is the real question, to print this without the notion of including a father. You can go to the next ad. This is the ad that was just out. This is Burnt Bees, and I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy. But again, a mother with two daughters, no father, but everyone else has a father. This is where we have to challenge the media, not just TV, not just film, print ads, because if we allow this to continue, then Moynihan Report continues to have a life force. If we allow this to continue and say, listen, although there are some that may be single parents, we still need to have representation of those who may have a mother and father in the household. And I think that this is the pushback of the voice in social media, in writing, in voicing. This is too comfortable for ad agencies to allow this to happen. And they believed that no one would push back. Burnt Bees was surprised, according to reports, that people were absolutely angered by that image and representation. But that's our fight. That's where we have to say, you have to represent all of the community and how we look, because they are comfortable excluding us, separating us, not as a unit. And I think that we have to, as media consumers, push back on how we are portrayed in popular media. No more can someone be at that table writing about us and not us at that table. We have to have a voice. I think this is the end of my presentation. Good. So I will come back and have more of a discussion with my other two colleagues about media representation, but I wanted to just give something to think about as we are talking about whether it's hip hop music and lyrics, whether we're talking about media representation. Too often we just see things and we just shake our heads. But that's our next movement of a fight, is to question how we are portrayed and question who's been at the table writing. Um, because I think we are just hungry for clear and honest representation of how we are portrayed. And we have to realize, I know we all on this call do understand, but I'm very concerned about how we are represented even globally, because these films are now global representation of history of how we are being perceived, and we have to challenge those images. So thank you for listening. And my next presenter, Dr. Adolf, will be talking about hip hop music, and I know I'm going to learn a lot.
What? Go right in. Yeah, check this out. One thing that I cannot stand as a dad is for someone to tell me who I am or what I am. But imagine if we as fathers have the opportunity to write our own script. Be a father to the child. Hello, my name is Dr. Jl Adolf, professor and lead vlogger of the Dad Cipher, a hip-hop guide to fatherhood. And I'm here to discuss how Black men has revised, or rather remixed, the narrative, or lack thereof, the narrative of urban Black fatherhood and the Monahan. In 1965, politician and sociologist Daniel Patrick Monahan wrote a report entitled "The Negro Family, A Call for Action." That's right, I said it, the Negro family, because that's what we were referred to back then. And his report, in many respects, was groundbreaking. He really described racism as something that was infecting America's bloodstream. You could consider it like the COVID virus from 1619. And the thing that I really loved about this particular report, he talks about racism as being more than just everyday individualistic hatred. He talks about it in the form of systemic racism, and he looks at it from poverty to unemployment to the legalized terrorism of the Black body. He does an excellent job with that. And as I was reading it, I was like, okay, I feel you, Daniel. This is on point. I was like, okay, we're talking about change and we're talking about how these systemic issues impact the Black family. However, the report came to a screeching halt when he reduced the problems that are plaguing Black communities to simply the family structure. In many cases, it's like blaming the cough for the reason why you are sick with a cold. In a sense, he makes the argument that the pathology, and when I say pathology, what that means is the origin of disease. He said the origin of the disease that is impacting the Black communities is the weak family structure. That's when I'm like, oh, this doesn't hit right at all. This is not hitting right at all. Primarily because what has happened in this particular report is a simple bait and switch. We talk about systemic racism and institutional racism, and then it's switched to say, well, the root cause of this is the Black family, which reduces something systemic to an individualistic problem. In a sense, it looks like the problems that are impacting the Black community have more to do with personal responsibility and people not being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Although he had the best intentions to help out the Black community, he's missing a key ingredient to his sauce, and that is the authentic voice of urban fathers. If we're talking about the Black community and we're talking about the issues that plague the Black community, it seemed that it would be essential to have the narrative and the voices of Black fathers, especially considering that Moynihan blames a lot of the social issues on the poor Black families. As a matter of fact, his work engages in classism, racism, and gender stereotypes. He basically makes the argument that Black families are struggling, one, because they are matriarchal led, or basically, in other words, women are running the household too much. Number two, he makes the argument that Black men are having too many illegitimate children. Number three, he talks about unwed liaisons. So in a sense, if you're not in the traditional nuclear Black family, in other words, your family is dysfunctional. And also, in addition to that, he described Black males as primarily criminal. Now let's fast forward to the 1980s through 90s. And you would swear that the Moynihan report was being put on wax. Like MCs were spitting bars that for the most part was re-emphasizing some of the stereotypes that Moynihan had about Black fathers. Although I like to wax nostalgic about the golden era of hip-hop of the 1980s and 1990s, but it was quite problematic when we talk about narratives that describe Black fatherhood. For instance, only one song during that particular time period really gave an authentic look at Black fathering from an authentic Black male perspective. And that was Grandmaster Flash in the Furious Five's The Message. In that particular song, it was one of the earliest songs that really featured a father and son dialogue.
My son said, "Daddy, I don't want to go to school because the teacher's a jerk. He must think I'm a fool."
And in that particular song, the father is recalling the conversation that he's having with his son, where his son is really questioning the importance of school. And he's looking at the education that he is receiving is keeping him locked within his social position. And so the song talks about unemployment, poverty, crime. And it's all linked to redlining, where we have groups of marginalized communities all compacted together. And that particular concentration of Black poverty and bleakness has led to a sort of absence of vision when it comes to Black males. It's a sort of invisibility that is taking place as all of these communities of color are locked in one space, which is called a concrete jungle, in which the larger mainstream society can just largely ignore. The son talks about, and it's really kind of a painful retelling when he says that he doesn't really see much hope for his future because he lives in an environment where there is no diversity of thought or vision. Matter of fact, he lives in this hyper ghetto, and because these areas are marginalized and it is filled with crime and violence and largely ignored by the powers that be, many of the youth do not, in a sense, or have a harder time gaining access to really positive Black male role models. And we also got to think, in the time of the 1980s and 90s, we're dealing with Reaganomics and the mass incarceration of Black men. Also, we're dealing with deindustrialization, which means that a lot of the jobs that was used to provide, where a man with just a high school diploma could provide for his family, have been outsourced. And so what you find is these sort of economic deserts that's taking place in these communities, and not to mention the light that lights up this whole gasoline field situation is the crack epidemic that took place. So what we see in this particular song by The Message, he talks of it really through a father and son conversation. We see how these social factors that are de-emphasized in the Monahan report are impacting the family structure, as opposed to the family structure itself just being dissolved because of lack of personal responsibility and one's inability to assert their manhood. As we move further into the golden era of hip hop, what we begin to find is fatherhood narratives being written by adolescent black males who for the most part, have lost their fathers in the system when it comes to incarceration or drug addiction. And their narratives really depict black fathers as being absentee or abandoners or sort of abusers. And basically, the father is depicted as a sort of cure-all to all the problems that are impacting the family structure. So in many cases, it sort of emulates what Monahan is talking about. Now, in particular, when rappers like, let's say, Tupac in the song Papa's Song, what he does is, in his narrative, he depicts the black father as just a father who is absentee, and because he's absentee, that the mothers are working menial jobs and being unable to, quote unquote, serve as the natural caretaker and nurturer. And as a result, these kids have no one and they have to live life in the streets. But what's really not shown in these songs was the social and political impact that these sort of policies like Reaganomics had, and their role and involvement in the systematic removal of these fathers. In particular, through 3 verses of Tupac's song, you find fathers being portrayed in a largely negative light. And however, when you get to the end of the song, it's quite ironic, because Tupac then begins to impersonate the father. And basically, once again, reaffirms that Monahan's depiction of black fatherhood as simply in economic terms. So in other words, the black father is portrayed as one who just provides the economic provisions for the family and nothing else. And in that particular verse, the father was struggling to provide for his family, so he willingly chose the lifestyle of street life. And because he could not provide financially for his family, he, in the result, engaged in underground economies, drug dealing. Yet throughout the song is portrayed as personal responsibility as opposed to the absence of choices. In Jay-Z and Beanie Siegel, Where Have You Been?, we see that fathers are showed as abusers. There's no real context behind the violent and abusive behaviors. It is as if these fathers as innately evil without looking at the social political forces that impact and constructed their sort of life. Void in these songs are kinship or other positive male role models or examples of people who have overcome the odds. I find that it's quite problematic, and it plays into the narrative spun by Monahan. Last but not least, you'll have Other examples of didactic hip hop songs like Be a Father to Your Child.
Be a father. If not, why bother, son? A boy can make him, but a man can raise one.
In which the narrator, Ed O.G. from Ed O.G. and the Bulldogs, basically laments black fathers and say that they are, in a sense, are functioning as dead beats instead of being dead broke. And it's a big difference. Ronald Mincy talks in great detail in his books about how low-income fathers are dead broke instead of dead beat. Deadbeat is usually a stereotype given to one who has the financial means to provide but refuses to do so, in which early child support was used. Ironically, child support was a system that was really geared towards suburban white fathers. However, black men in the 80s became the poster boys for the quote-unquote deadbeat, when in actuality they should have been dead broke fathers, because many during this particular time period did not have the financial means to do so. However, one thing that I will highlight that Ed O.G. and the Bulldogs, Be a Father to the Child, it did add some complexity to what it means to be a provider, because in the song he states it's not the presence, meaning the gifts, it's your presence, or one being there that is most important in a child's life. So in particular, that was one of the earlier hip hop songs that really where we're beginning to see a sort of turn in how black fathers are beginning to be perceived in narratives.
Yeah, I'm your father figure. Oh. That's why I'm your father figure. Oh.
Now, as much as a lot of old school hip hop heads like to condemn the new generation with all the, the auto-tune raps and the ad libs and the skirts and all of that stuff that's listed into the songs, and even for some of subject matters that lack substance, we have to really acknowledge how the new school hip hop artists are helping to change the narratives when it comes to black fatherhood. In particular, in a lot of young hip hop artists like J. Cole, Chance the Rapper, Don Tripp, J.I.D., Toby and Wigway, a lot of the newer school rappers are complicating the narratives when it comes to hip hop culture. In particular, songs that come to mind is Chance the Rapper, Lord Release.
And she wants me to get out of the drug game. She doesn't realize how much it causes me pain. I just want my son to grow up with a dad with him.
Where we're looking at a marginalized urban father who has limited opportunities, living in a marginalized community, living in a redlining district, and he's engaging in underground economies. But what makes his story different is we begin to see a deep psychological struggle that takes place, a sort of cognitive dissonance, and a sense of, when I say cognitive dissonance, it's like the rapper, or as narrator, is aware that as a dad, he is not living the life that he wants to live. However, his lack of opportunities have forced him to engage in what we call heroic masculinity. Now, heroic masculinity, in a sense, is American as American Pie, because what it means is that one has to become a rebel in order to become a breadwinner. You will find this when we talk about white males in stories like Breaking Bad, or like Shameless, where these fathers will, because they have been denied access to the American dream, they're able to inverse that dream by engaging in these underground economies to provide for their families. However, when we talk about depictions of black fathers in hip hop, we see that it's a sort of reluctant heroic masculinity. And what makes it reluctant, it's not that the fathers depicted in these stories really want to willfully engage. It's just a limited amount of opportunities that force them into it. And also, a lot of them are dealing with the stigma of absentee fathers from the 80s and 90s. So what we find in Chance the Rapper, Lord Release, we find a fatherless father who wants to be a better father to his children. He is haunted by that. So we see the psychological trauma that's taking place. And psychological trauma is something that's largely ignored in the Monahan report, like it's largely ignored today, that the impact of mental health and how it impacts Black fathers. But what we find in a particular song is that the father doesn't want to engage in it, but he feels like he's forced to. He's seeking all opportunities. He even goes to the church and he's seeking some sort of transformative motivation that can help him to get out of his financial situation in order to provide. He's seeking, in a way, for a sense of fatherhood, a father identity that is not limited to just the financial provisions that one can offer. And we find that even in Don Tripp's Letter to My Son.
I just wanna see my side. Matter of fact, I'm in school right now in case the music don't work and I can put the work down.
He even talks about in great detail about his struggles in terms of trying to provide, where he's trying to he's living this sort of dichotomous life where he's trying to lead the dirty dollars of the underground economy, and he's trying to seek to learn a trade that can provide financially for his household. However, in addition to his economic struggles, he talks about maternal gatekeeping, explosive relationship between the mother of his child and himself has led him in a situation where he has to wade through negative co-parenting to try to even establish a relationship with his son. And again, these are issues MCs are really dealing with that complicates what we traditionally think about the narrative of Black fatherhood. And in particular, what he is talking about is the role that the court system plays and how fathers are perceived and how he wants to change this his narrative, but he feels helpless to do so. So with all of that said, hip hop offers a new sort of script, a new narrative that can help practitioners. It can help policymakers to really take the time to really listen to the voices that are emerging out of these communities to come up with a real call for action that includes the narratives of these fathers. I imagine that even if a practitioner does not want to comb through hip hop lyrics and that sort of thing to find a problem, perhaps they could use some of these hip hop songs as forms of engagement that can help ease these fathers that we want to serve into a place of comfort where they can feel like they can share their stories, they can be vulnerable, that they can wear their trauma on their sleeve. Hip hop fatherhood narratives really are adding more visibility, and they're complicating the stories that about Black fatherhood that we have heard since 1965 when it comes to Daniel Monahan. And I hope that it will continue to complicate this conversation and will lead to more research for the betterment of the African American community. Ooh, when you get this man a mic, he talks a long time. But lastly, I just want to make sure that all the practitioners out there, please comb through these narratives for engagement. the biggest issue, as I stated, with the Monahan reports and with researchers that do not talk directly to the group that they're trying to serve and work with, is that you're missing the opportunity to really engage in a deeper relationship. A lot of times I want to avoid practitioners and researchers thinking that the African American fatherhood just need to be rescued. What they need is a deep, meaningful relationship that's going to lead to better policies and to better families and to better communities. And hip hop is a voice that speaks for those urban fathers who are who in media are oftentimes demonized and are invisible. So just thank you all for the time. And with no further ado, I will take this back to Mr. Wilbon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adolf. And listen, that was a powerful, Dr. Kelly started us off with, building the runway, right? And I could feel the engine of the plane starting and the propeller spinning. And so that's you took us, Dr. Adolf, to that point where we are almost ready to get on our takeoff. And so I thank you for that information. I tell you what, I seen somebody put in the chat that they've never looked at fatherhood in the context of hip hop music. And so thank you for sharing that information. And Dr. Kelly, I'll just say back to you, thank you for the information about the James Evans. James Evans is probably one of my favorite fathers through media, only because there are times I could see myself as a father raising kids that I mirror James Evans, and so we're constantly, portraying those roles. And so thank you for highlighting just the length of how media has portrayed us. And then I've seen a lot of folks talk about the media ads and the portrayal in the chat. And so I think this is going to lead us into some awesome dialogue in just a little bit. But before we go there, I have a poll question I want to ask folks that are a part of this webinar. The poll question I have is, how have you ever attended any other Father Incorporated webinars in the past? And so you could just select the answer there that's on the screen, and that we'll be able to go ahead and kind of see. So just, have you attended a Fathers Incorporated webinar in the past? We're trying to gauge to see who we have in our space on today. I don't see any responses coming in yet. You can clearly hit the...
There are responses coming in, man. 83%. 56% said yes, 36% said no, 8% said unsure. And so, so a little over half and half, which is a great thing, meaning that we're touching a new audience. And so thank you so much for attending to the poll.
Thank you so much. All right, so that was our first poll question. And so we're going to move, there we go. Thank you so much. We're going to move forward, and we're going to have Dr. Armand Perry come with his presentation. Again, use the chat box. I see a lot of dialogue going on in the chat box, and I appreciate it. It is so a breath of fresh air to see that happening. And then there's also the question and answer box there. That you're able to post questions in there, and then we'll get around to answering those questions. But after Dr. Perry, we'll go ahead and open up for a series of question and answer and some dialogue as we continue with our webinar. Dr. Perry?
Thanks, Lawrence. And thank you all for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I certainly appreciate having a chance to engage and co-present with my colleagues, Drs. Kelly and Adolf. When reflecting on this opportunity, the first people who came to mind were Gary Payton and Isaiah Thomas. I feel like Sean Kemp, right? Because I'm working with people who are throwing me perfect alley-oops, and the only job I have to do is to catch it and not miss the dunk. So I'm gonna try my best to not miss the dunk and as we come toward the end here. But I think that more than anything else, both Doctors Kelly and Adolf did an outstanding job of helping us to understand a large part of the macro, right? So in terms of how it is that these issues play themselves out in a broader society and the impact that they have on us in terms of the way in which our families are perceived. What I want to attempt to do is talk a little bit about some of those same issues, but then provide a little bit of concrete examples toward the end so that we can talk a little bit at the micro level so that we have sort of a balanced discussion there with both the conceptual and theoretical, but as well as the practical, and then we can open it up for questions. So if we can go to the next slide, let's see what we have. So yeah, I want to try to do a few things, talk a little bit about father involvement, talk about racism. We want to talk about the influence and impact of racism on father's involvement. And as I mentioned, talk about some practical strategies for intervention, as well as some practical examples of how these things manifest themselves in and around the communities where you live. And then again, as always, open it up for an interactive dialogue. Next slide. So this is just a follow-up on that. Again, we want to define terms like racism, oppression, and controlling images. Certainly racism is something that we all know about. Oppression probably as well. Controlling images may be new to some. So anyway, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Discussing the role of race and racism and its influence and impact on fathers' involvement, discussing the importance of fathers and their impact on racism and the ways in which dads either can or can't take active roles in their children's lives. I think there it's important for us to remember and add to our sort of vocabulary, our lexicon, or whatever phrase you want to use, that distinction that Dr. Adolf talked about, right? So he talked about the idea of deadbeat, and the idea of a deadbeat dad is something that has already permeated the broader society. People know that language, it's commonplace, but an important nuance, but no less important distinction is this idea of a dead broke dad, right? Because oftentimes here in America, we reduce people to sort of economic essentialism, and we really do that with men because the broader society suggests or indicates that if men have any role in the family, it's to be a financial provider. Yet with Black fathers, both historically and contemporarily, it's never extended the same opportunities for people to be able to fulfill those roles, right? So it's a catch-22 in that way. And there were several people in the chat who talked about some of the ways in which that happens, whether it be through macroeconomic policy, public assistance eligibility, and things of that nature. So we'll get into a little bit of that as well. And then the last thing is sharing, again, some practical strategies so that as people walk away, not only for themselves, but also in their circles of influence, some things that they may be able to do to help stem the tide. Because again, these are large issues. And if we don't begin to take them on collectively, I think that we'll just come back next year and the year after that and the year after that talking about the same thing. So again, some strategies for intervention. Next slide, please. So just really quick, we want to talk about when we talk about involvement from a sort of a research perspective, involvement is oftentimes divided into three different arms, right? If you could think about it in that way, or a stool with three legs. And one of the legs is what we call engagement. Engagement has to do with the one-on-one interaction that's focused and individual. So if you can envision a dad playing catch in the yard with his daughter or his son, that would be an example of engagement. You're talking about two people engaged in a one-on-one interaction where there are no other distractions. And necessarily both of those people need to be in the same place, in the same space in order to have that engagement. Next is accessibility, and accessibility does not require that both people be in the same place at the same time. It also doesn't even require any one-on-one interaction, but accessibility has to do with the extent to which a father is readily available to his child if and when needed. So in other words, does dad have his kid's cell phone number, or do the kids have dad's cell phone number? Do they have an email address for them, or do they follow each other on social media? Again, to what extent are they able to get in contact with one another if and when they are needed? Now, keep in mind, that doesn't require any one-on-one interaction at all. So as we go down the list of dimensions of involvement, we get more and more abstract, with, again, engagement being one-on-one interaction, face-to-face, accessibility being less about one-on-one interaction and more about the extent to which dad and child can get a hold of one another if and when needed. And then third, there is what we call responsibility. Responsibility requires no one-on-one interaction at all, but is really a manifestation of love and concern. So in other words, when a dad calls a doctor to make an appointment for a well baby visit or a doctor's checkup, or goes to pick this kid up from school when the kid is sick, or even when a dad goes to work and earns a living and uses portions of his income to provide for a child, all of those are examples of responsibility because they are demonstrations or manifestations of love and concern. So again, so as we think about father involvement, oftentimes what we think about is what we know as engagement, which is the time spent, the one-on-one interaction. But I think a more comprehensive view of fatherhood encapsulates all three of these levels, whether it be engagement, accessibility, and responsibility. I think it's also important to remember all three of these levels, because if we think exclusively about involvement as engagement, that necessarily disadvantages non-resident fathers, right? Men who, for whatever reason, don't live in the same home with their children. These men who have limited opportunities to engage their children. But these are men who can certainly be accessible to their children, and these are men who can certainly demonstrate responsibility for their children. So again, so one of the things I think is important to do in this discussion is to provide a context or a backdrop for how it is that we define father involvement, because once we set those expectations, it necessarily has implications for how it is that we view, assess, and perceive whether or not folks are living up to it, right? So beyond involvement, racism is obviously a mistreatment of people based on race. Oppression moves a little bit beyond the individual and has to do with systemic or pervasive mistreatment of people based on their membership in a certain group. These are things that restrict the opportunities. And it's also important to know that this doesn't necessarily require any overt discrimination. But again, I think Dr. Adolf touched on, as well as Dr. Kelly, when they gave us sort of a chronology, right? Some of you all may be familiar with this term known as benign neglect that came to us in the 1960s, particularly out of the Nixon administration, which had to do with the idea that for many Black communities, if you wanted to decimate them or disadvantage them, that you didn't have to go in and necessarily do anything to them, but you could simply ignore them and then allow them to be divested in. And if you pay attention, depending on where you all are from, I know we were going around the horn when we first got on. There were people from Pennsylvania, and so if you're from, I know there was somebody from Camden, New Jersey. I know that Camden, New Jersey is right across the river from Philly, right? So if you're familiar with Philly, you know that there are parts of Philadelphia, particularly North Philly, that have been decimated simply because they've been ignored, right? If folks are from Chicago and spent time around Chicago, you know that places like Gary, Indiana, used to be manufacturing hubs, but as a result of outsourcing and never any real intentionality around replacing that work, we know that these are places that have been decimated by macroeconomic policy and other decisions that have been made to not reinvest in those places. So again, so when we think about oppression, certainly we think about some of the more traditional overt discrimination, but it's also important that we think about the idea of benign neglect, which is just to simply leave a community alone and leave them to their own devices with no effort, no intention around investment. And then last here is the idea of institutional discrimination, which is that discrimination that's built into the norms of society by those in power. And so, again, we see that on a regular and routine basis, particularly as it relates to Black folks here in the United States. Next slide, please. And so just a little bit of demographic trends and some contextualization. We know that Black fathers tend to be married less often and co-resident than fathers of other races. So these are just some of the demographic realities. Again, another reason why it's important for us to broaden our definition around involvement, because if we use a sort of a white mainstream definition of involvement, necessarily we become disproportionately disadvantaged because of that engagement piece, right? And the reality that many Black fathers have limited opportunities to engage their children because they do not co-reside with them. What's unfortunate is that what we oftentimes do, and I think this is a mistake, is we use married and involved interchangeably, right? And so implicit in that statement is if a dad is not married or if he doesn't co-reside with his children, many of us take that and we make assumptions or presumptions as if that dad is not involved simply because he does not co-reside with his child. And we know that to not be the case. As a matter of fact, the CDC, the third bullet point here, provides us with empirical support for the idea that Black non-resident fathers tend to be more involved in caregiving and nurturing activity than fathers of other races. And so again, and I think that speaks to the interest and desire for Black fathers to take active roles in their children's lives, which again flies in the face of much of what it is that we see in the media, for all of the reasons that both Dr. Kelly and Adolf so astutely pointed out. The other thing that I think is important to point out here is that, again, because what we have here in this country, we have across the family institution, but every other institution in American society, is what we have is a sort of a white norm that's established as the standard, and any and all deviations from that are seen as deviant or inferior. And that's misinformed thinking, right? And so we know that the history of our people here in this country, we've always had cultural variance on what has been deemed to be the mainstream model. And so, for example, we know that Black fathers tend to receive support from extended families, whereas in much of the mainstream society, there's more of an emphasis placed on the nuclear family. But our folks tend to be more collective in nature. And not only is that a byproduct of our broader history from before we were brought here, but it's also the case that even as we were brought here to the United States, we've had to be resilient in the face of whether it be discrimination, oppression, benign neglect, and a whole host of other attempts to subvert our independence and our agency here in this place. And so the way that we tend to do things looks differently. Oftentimes, again, not all of the times, but oftentimes. But it's a mistake to confuse being different or doing things differently with doing things incorrectly. There is no one right way to be a family. So it's important that we keep that in mind, even as we think about some of the images that we are presented with and bombarded with, and the way in which those things tend to seep into our consciousness. And we internalize them because of the prevalence and because of the volume of these messages that we receive. Next slide, please. And so what's this impact of racism on fathers' involvement? We've talked a little bit about the divestment and social dislocation, which has to do with the intentional discrimination or the benign neglect that we've talked a little bit about. We know that the influence of the impact is that it's made it more difficult for men of color to secure gainful employment. And we also know that because the broader society tends to reduce people to what they either do or don't have in their bank account, what happens is, in many ways, in many circles and in many spaces, what we've done is we've marginalized Black fathers, particularly those who are low-income fathers, because we've equated financial provision with paternal involvement. And again, I think that's a mistake for all the reasons that we've mentioned. And that's one of the other reasons why I wanted to broaden the definition of involvement, so that we have a clear understanding of all of the ways, the range of ways that dads can take active roles in their children's lives. In addition to the purely economic piece, we know that Black fathers tend to disproportionately and negatively be impacted by issues related to mass incarceration. Dr. Adolf touched on that. Redlining, I think Isaac Cook, I think is the person's name in the chat, touched on the idea of redlining. That was also in Dr. Adolf's presentation. We know that issues related to environmental injustice, food deserts, and so on and so forth, all of these things disproportionately influence and impact the lives of Black people, with Black fathers playing a large role in that as well. In addition to things like mass incarceration, we know that even independent of whether or not a person goes to jail or prison, we also know that having contact with law enforcement has been associated with challenges in co-parenting relationship because of the stress and strain of being surveilled and feeling surveilled and over-policed in your own communities, and the way in which that has negative influences and impacts on romantic relationships and co-parenting relationships. There were several people who touched on this in the chat too, but we also know that public policy has not been the friend of Black families. That's both historically and contemporarily. We see that, ironically, public assistance, its stated purpose is to provide a safety net for families, but when it comes to Black families, the way in which policy has been developed and oftentimes implemented, we know that there's been a large hole in the safety net, right? And some would argue that the hole was cut there intentionally so that our families fell through the cracks. And based on what we know about the development of that policy and the implementation of it, it's difficult to refute that. So always important to talk policy when we talk about disparate incomes. We also know that, again, African-American fathers and their relationships with their families has also been negatively influenced by their contact with the criminal justice system. And the last line of defense, again, is supposed to be human and social service providers. But even there, we see that they've been found to be reluctant to engage fathers of all races, but particularly fathers who are Black or African American. So again, we see that every step along the way, there are barriers and there's obstacles that Black families, in particular Black fathers, end up having to overcome just to play the types of roles in their children's lives that we all, as a broader society, expect. And so again, as we think about what we see before us in terms of outcomes, it's important that we have a contextualization to be able to understand that. Next slide, please. And so now we get to this idea of controlling images. And so if you think about the opening presentation from Dr. Kelly, when she displayed those images, and we see those images in historic sort of discussions and discourses, but as she pointed out, even in the contemporary, we see people like Childish Gambino bringing these things back so that we do not forget where they come from, so that we don't forget the influence and impact. Dr. Adolf talked about more of the contemporary in terms of hip hop music and some of the ways in which images and portrayals are shaped by and shape our perceptions of Black fathers and Black families. When you see the ads that Dr. Kelly presented to us, where Black fathers are conspicuously missing, it leads to questions about how and why this happens, right? And I think many of us have a pretty good idea about how and why it happens. The point of this is, when you add up all of the times you're bombarded with an image that suggests to you that Black men are dangerous, are criminal, are hypersexual, or when we're talking family, the absence of an image, right? So that makes them invisible, just like Dr. Kelly pointed out. What happens is, Patricia Hill Collins would call that a controlling image, and which is defined as an image that is designed to make things like racism, sexism, etc., appear to be natural, normal, and built into everyday life. So in other words, what happens is, you think about, for me, the best way to describe this is, every morning I wake up, I take a shower, and I put on lotion, right? And you put that lotion on, and the lotion is absorbed into your skin, right? The skin is a semi-permeable surface, right? There are things that can cross that sort of barrier there. And you actually end up internalizing bits and pieces of the lotion. And similarly, when you're talking about years and decades of being bombarded with images that suggest to you that Black men are things like dangerous and criminal when absent from the family, we also internalize those messages as well. And it becomes the way in which we view and perceive Black men and Black fathers. And so it makes it appear to be natural and normal in 2020 when you run a Christmas ad that talks about matching pajamas. It makes it appear natural and normal to exclude Black men from any of the ads when it's clear that you've been intentional about including as many different types of family constellations as you possibly could, right? And so that's what Patricia Hill Collins is talking about when she talks about controlling images. And so when we go back to Dr. Adolf, when he talked about the idea of deadbeat, so the question then becomes, based on what we know about these controlling images and the images that we've been bombarded with, if I were to ask you to draw a picture of a deadbeat dad or a sperm donor, what would it look like, right? And so I do this in trainings with practitioners and professionals, and I actually bring them sheets of papers and crayons. So draw me a picture of a deadbeat, right? And when people are honest, what they do is the first thing they do is they pick up the brown crayon, right? And it speaks to the ways in which they've been influenced and impacted by the images that they've been bombarded with, which blends credence to Patricia Hill Collins' notions of a controlling image. Because again, what it shows is that those images have been internalized and those messages have infiltrated people's perceptions. So the question then becomes, how is it that these images and perceptions manifest themselves in the lived experiences, not only the people that we know and care about, but also in practice and policy? Next slide, please. And so, but hold on, don't press play yet, Lawrence. Oh, yeah, you can go to the next slide, just don't press play yet. So what you're looking at here is what I think is a pretty clear example of the way in which controlling images manifest themselves in the lived experiences of the people who absorb them. And so on your far left and your far right, what you're looking at are screenshots of a TV show that used to air here in Louisville, Kentucky on public television. The name of the television show was called Deadbeat Kentuckiana. And this is the most deplorable thing you've ever seen in your life, because the setup of the show was to bring a camera into child support court and film the interactions of the non-custodial parents, who were disproportionately men and disproportionately Black men, to record their interactions with family court judges who, to my way of thinking, would simply recognize the cameras and the lights on in the back of the room, and they would start performing, right? In these sort of hyperbolic and sensationalized ways. Again, this is the most deplorable thing you've ever seen in your life in terms of the degradation, in terms of the lack of empathy, in terms of the willful and intentional degradation of like actual real life people, right? And so I offer that to you because, again, when we talk about these images and we're talking about people being bombarded with them over and over and over and over again, how does that manifest itself in terms of influencing and shaping people's perceptions? Well, the middle picture you see there is about two fathers 2 years ago. The Louisville Courier-Journal, which is the major newspaper here where I live, reached out to me to do an op-ed around Father's Day. And so my op-ed talked about the idea that rather than doing things like criminalizing and demonizing fathers, what we needed to do was be more willful and intentional about providing them with the resources that they need so that they could secure the types of capacity that they needed to take the roles, the more active roles in their children's lives that all of us wanted. Well, my op-ed was pit against an op-ed by the then governor of Kentucky, a guy named Matt Bevin. And if you've seen Matt Bevin's act, you already know that this was going to be foolishness on his part. And he did not let us down, because that's exactly what he went on to do. And so if you also know anything about Matt Bevin, you know that he had a following of people who we don't have any reason to believe saw Black people as whole human beings, right? And so you combine the idea that I was being pit against the then governor of the state of Alabama, who had a following of people who did not largely see Black people as whole human beings, combined with the fact that these are people who are regularly bombarded with images that portray Black men as subhuman. And the next day I come to work and there's a voicemail on my phone, and this is what it says. Lawrence, if you will go ahead and play that.
Perry read with interest your story about fathers on Father's Day and so forth. I think you're kind of missing the point. The Black community needs to train their sons as they grow up, and the fathers be around, if not in the family, but be around, and give support to the children. White people don't have support groups, need money, go to nonprofits for all kind of BS. It's a matter of respect, and the fathers that father these children don't respect the mamas, don't respect the children, and don't really give a damn. And they don't need another government funding, payout, bribe, nonprofit to tell them to get off their ass and do what normal people do. And they should be normal. They just don't care. I hope you'll do some research on that subject. Take care.
Received June 18th at 8:42 a.m. To repeat, press 1 to.
Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah.
Perry read with interest.
So among other things, if you listen to that and didn't find yourself sort of dumbfounded by it, I'm not sure what else would do it. There are a few things that I wanted to point out. First, he clearly believes that Black people are not normal, which was interesting. Beyond that, he talked about the idea that white people did not need support groups and nonprofits. So I am a social work professional, I've been so for 13 years. And one of the people on my dissertation committee was one of the world's most renowned social work historians. I'm pretty sure that both support groups and social services were founded by white people for white people, right? Right. The notion of social services is basically a reverse FUBU. It was for them, by them. And that has always been the case. It continues to be the case. So, but again, it's clear that he has a narrative about what it means to be a Black man, and he basically outed himself as a racist and as a person who sees us as less than human. So anyway, so we'll move beyond that. I wanted to present that to you to give you an example of how it is that these controlling images not only are created, but how they manifest themselves in the lived experiences of the people around us. Certainly, I want to reserve some time for the Q&A, so I'll move through the last slide somewhat expeditiously. But before we do that, I want to leave you with some practical strategies for interventions. One, I think it's important for us as individuals, and even for us as individuals who work in organizations, to reflect on the extent to which we are being influenced and impacted by these issues, and call your agencies and organizations out when you see these things manifest themselves, right? It's also important that we understand and appreciate the fact that race is a social construction. So in other words, men and women have made the determination that differences that are not biological appear to be or present themselves as biological and natural, right? What we've done is men and women have decided that people who have fair skin, slim noses, thin lips, with ancestors from the United Kingdom and Germany and Slovakia, we put them all together and we call them white folks. And then we've done the same thing, people with coarser hair, darker skin, fuller lips, with ancestors from the Ivory Coast and the People's Republic of Congo or Nigeria. We put all of those people together and we call them Black people, right? And so then what we do is, once we've had all of these people grouped, then what we do inevitably is we then assign value to the groups. And when you live in a place where the majority of the folks are white people, it doesn't take a PhD to figure out that when they group all of us together, the group that begins to be devalued is the group that's not them, right? And that basically explains our entire history here in this country, up until the contemporary. And so it's important for us to understand and appreciate that race is a social construction, right? It's important for us to acknowledge that privilege exists from a racial standpoint, also from a gender standpoint, and many other intersectional identities. It's important for us to stop deficit framing, right? And by deficit framing, we're talking about thinking about people and defining them by the challenges and the obstacles that they face, right? Many of us need to, if we've not already done this, we need to introduce ourselves to some implicit bias training. And that's really, really important at an organizational level. If your organization has not done some team building or some strategic planning around implicit bias, it needs to do that like yesterday. And to the point that I think was really, really salient and clear in Dr. Kelly's presentation, particularly with the ad campaigns, we have to diversify our decision-making bodies, because it became clear to me, and I would imagine many of you, there was a conversation going on in the chat, that the people at Burt's Bees and Macy's, they clearly didn't have any authentic Black people at their decision-making tables that they respected, because had they done so, those folks would have let them know, like, this is not going to end well. And so either one or two things happened. Either they did not have those people at the table, or they did have them at the table and they chose to ignore them. So again, so we have to diversify our decision-making bodies so as to have the types of representation in these places, in these spaces, so that we can influence the process from the beginning. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. And so this is the last slide. If you go back one, Lawrence. Yeah, that right there. And that's just a link to some implicit bias training and some information. There's a CDC report that I mentioned to you that supports the idea that among non-resident fathers, Black fathers tend to be the most actively involved in their children's lives. So again, so we talk about countering some of these narratives. I think the best way to do that is with empirical data. And so I would be remiss if I didn't provide you with some resources to help you make those arguments in your circles of influence. And so that is indeed the balance of my time. And so, Lawrence, back to you.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for that presentation. Again, the chat box was on fire during the presentation. Thank you all for contributing, asking questions, making comments in the chat box. Look, we are doing pretty good on time, so we want to go ahead and move quickly. But I actually have two more poll questions I want to raise to the attendees before we get into our question and answer portion. And again, use the question and answer box to put questions in. There's one sitting there now, and I think Dr. Perry's looking at it, so we'll get that addressed here in just a minute. But make sure you put some question and answers, or questions, excuse me, in that question and answer box for us. But for the polls, we have two questions we want to ask. The next question, the first question is, has this webinar helped you understand, has the webinar helped you in your understanding of Black fathers, men in the media? Go ahead and submit your answers real quickly. We just want to get a poll of folks here. Thank you so much for those that are submitting their responses. Awesome, awesome, awesome. And then we'll move here. It looks like 83% said yes. I love that. We see a couple folks, 11% said somewhat, and then there was really no change in that by 6%, 3 folks report on that. So, and then my last question is, should there be a part 2 of this? Should there be a part 2 of this webinar? Is there anything else that we need to dig a little deeper to give more time? You know, we're at a time constraint, so we want to make sure to understand if we need to do a part 2 of this webinar. So please submit your answers, your responses. Thank you so much. I see a lot of comments. Excellent presentation. 80% said yes, we need a part 2. So I think we need to prepare a team for a part 2, and also to see if there are other folks who need to bring a part of that conversation. Thank you all for your responses. But some of the things in chat that I see, powerful presentation. I love this presentation. Should be a continuing series. Thank you so much for your feedback. Yolanda, we see your comment there. We'll take that into consideration for our part 2. But let's get into some of these questions. So the first question is actually directed to Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry, have you had a chance to look at the question in the question and answer? But I'll read it here quickly here. Dr. Perry, we're asking you to address the lack of automatic on-ramp for unmarried parents, particularly fathers of color, as compared to divorcing, in obtaining legal parenting, in obtaining legal parenting orders. Dr. Perry, you want to share any thoughts on that?
I do. I was actually typing up a response.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the truth is, when never married parents are very, as Deborah points out, never married parents are very disadvantaged when it comes to securing parenting time post relationship split up. So by law, things like parenting time and child support are automatically built into the adjudication of divorce proceedings, right? That's not at all the case with never married parents. As a matter of fact, the reverse is true. In order for them to have their cases adjudicated, they necessarily have to engage the courts. And when we're talking specifically about men and Black men, we know that there is a great deal of apprehension with the court system. And so you stop Black people on the court and say, hey, how likely is it that you're going to be willful and intentional about going to the courthouse to initiate an action? The answer to that is, well, no, right? And so for those very reasons, what I was doing when you came to me, Lawrence, is I recently completed a study that enrolled custodial mothers in a co-parenting intervention. And I think one of the more interesting findings was that most of the mothers were never married mothers. And so it speaks to the idea that when we can engage never married parents in these types of interventions, the interventions can produce positive outcomes. The issue, or the challenge is, as Deborah astutely points out, is that many of these interventions, people end up in them because they're mandated into them by a family court judge. Well, but if you don't see a family court judge because your case is not automatically adjudicated because you aren't previously married, you never have an opportunity to receive the intervention because you don't even know about it, right? And so one of the conclusions that I make in the final portion of the paper is that we need to make these interventions more broadly available to people so that you don't have to be court ordered or mandated into them, but they can just be out there in the community for people who see that there's a need for them. I'm going to include a link to the report there, and so that people who are interested can take a look at it and see it. And if they want to engage me in a larger discussion or a broader discussion or more detailed discussion after this, I'd be glad to do it. But again, I want to put the link in the chat so that, or in response to the question, so that people can see it and download it if they want to. It's a free download at the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network website. I'll also mention that there are 2 versions of it. There is a full report, which is 26 pages, and then there's a summary report, which is about 7 pages. And so you can get both and read them both, or you can download one or the other. But again, a really, really good question, because there was a lot of disproportionality there in terms of divorcing versus never married parents. So even when we talk non-resident fathers, we need to make distinctions between non-resident as a result of divorce or non-resident as a result of never being married, because the 2 situations could not be different, even though we have a tendency to clump them all together.
Thank you so much. I did have one other question as you're putting those links in the chat. Someone did ask for the implicit bias training links as well. If you could put that in the chat as well, that was a part of your presentation.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that.
All right, thank you. Ryan asked if someone could talk more about the food desert piece. That came up, I believe it was in your presentation as well, Dr. Perry, around, I think you mentioned it, but is there any way you could talk a little more about that, or how do you want to move further?
Yeah, sure. I would imagine that any of us could speak to the issue of food desert, but certainly I'll take a stab at it. When I mention food desert, I'm talking about the idea that, and it was within the context of all of the different ways that Black people, in particular Black men, end up marginalized and disproportionately negatively influenced by the broader society, while at the same time being expected to live up to the exact same expectation and role that the majority of society says it should. And so we talked about things like mass incarceration that, again, are disproportionately and negatively impacting Black families. We talked about macroeconomic policy that sends manufacturing work overseas, disproportionately impacting Black families. We talk about issues like nutrition and environmental justice, and food deserts are a part of that, right? A food desert is a place and a space that is devoid of full service supermarkets that have options for fresh produce. So in other words, if we take a field trip to any quote unquote hood in America, I can guarantee you two things we will not find. One is a full service grocery store with fresh fruits and vegetables, and the other is a mainstream financial institution, otherwise known as a bank, right? These are things that do not appear in economically depressed, largely African-American communities and neighborhoods. And that is an example of that benign neglect that we were talking about, right? So what happens is over time, what we see is a divestment in African-American communities, while at the same time, there's an expectation that these people live up to this mainstream standard without any opportunity to have the exact same resource and opportunities that other people have. And so if a dad is trying to make sure that he is raising his family in a way that is consistent with the mainstream ideas, how in the world is he going to do that if he's hard pressed to find a job, and if he has money, he can't even get an apple or an orange or lettuce in his community? The only options he has are things that are high in sodium, processed foods, or hot Cheetos, right? Like those are the things that are in abundance in economically depressed neighborhoods, but things that are nutritious and actually feed your body and your mind, they aren't there. And those are willful and intentional decisions being made by people who are at those decision-making tables about where they will or won't put certain economic resources, things like grocery stores and mainstream financial institutions.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to add to that, or are we can move forward to the next question? All right, we had Dr. Jl Adolf actually mentioned, Dr. Adolf, were you going to respond to that?
No, I was waiting to move forward.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. She said we definitely need a part two, and she thinks that where and how we move forward with educating our families on media and literacy, media literacy, informing policy and marketing. So she's asking in part two, is that something that we can begin to look at some of those strategies of educating our families around media literacy and informing policy? Anybody want to respond to that? Is that something that we can look at?
Okay.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
JL, go ahead.
Okay. What I was going to say is it's a scholar here at Georgia State University by the name of Cheryl McArthur, and she did some excellent work that talks about the importance of training in her particular study, mothers training daughters in terms of media literacy and the images that's presented of women in particular in hip hop videos and that sort of thing for consumption. And she really talks about not only parents really becoming media informed, but also talking to their children in a way that is a non-judgmental and threat, because as parents, we have a tendency to say, what are you looking at? Oh, this is terrible. And that is not the approach that's going to reach the children. What we need is a deeper conversation that talks about imagery and that sort of thing. Expanding on Arthur's idea, I would say parents as a whole We have to have a conversation with our children with images that they see in media, and not only through hip hop, but through film and so on and so forth. I would say with my approach to parenting, and it's certainly not a one size fit all, but I having a background in hip hop lyricism allowed my children to basically listen to all types of hip hop, whether it talks about misogyny, whether it talks about violence and that sort of thing. But the catch was we had to deeply engage and talk about it. So a lot of times they would have to write about those ideas. So we would have to get into deep, meaningful conversations. So they're not just aimlessly consuming all of this material. So if they're going to hear something negative, I'm going to talk about, well, what are some of the systematic things that created that negative environment? And I feel like we as parents have to avoid just being in in a passenger seat. We really have to engage our children and stop playing down their tenure. I think our children are old enough to really understand material. And if not, it's better that it gets explained from you as a parent than the children talking to their peers. So that's my take on it.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kelly.
Just briefly, I'm glad she raised that question, because I think we can do, if we do a second series about techniques and the need, particularly when kids are young, if they are bombarded by TV shows, commercials, print ads, how do we begin to talk about race and racism at that early juncture, about what they're seeing, and also gender? When Dr. Perry was talking about, take a crayon and draw me a picture of a deadbeat dad, and they grab the brown crayon, that's where we need to have some discussions about how it permeates so quickly into the subconscious mind, that we need to have a conversation of how to stop it. And have those shows and say, well, what's missing in this picture? What's missing in this representation? And have more of a discussion of how to empower very early what they see and what they can say. No, I could be more critical as a critical consumer of how I think and how I now know I'm being manipulated by the media.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. And I think as we're preparing and planning part 2, there was a suggestion that was put in the question and answer piece about needing to add conversation about systemic racism, the topic of theory of superstructures and imperialism, colonialism, and Western and Christianity. So as we're planning to look at part 2, let's kind of keep those suggestions within our planning, in our mind when planning. Dr. Perry did put in the link, put a link in the chat with the resources around the co-parenting study. Also, he is going to put the implicit bias training link in there as well. But I would be remiss to mention that Fathers Incorporated also does implicit bias training. And so if you're interested in that, you can feel free to contact me, and I'll put my email address in the chat box so that you can reach out to me if you're interested in receiving those training. Before we wrap up, we're going to do something real quick. We want to see if there are any last burning questions. And the way you can do this is that if you're interested, you can use the raise hand function, and then we'll unmute you so you can ask your direct question in the last 5 minutes that we have here. Are there any burning questions here now? Any burning questions?
Mahashin Parker is unmuted. You're live and on the air with Lawrence Wilbon.
Do you have a question for us? I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Is there anybody else that have? Okay, we have. Is it Sharon Dirac?
Sharon, you're on the air.
I just, I'm not sure when it occurred to me. I know it was during the hip hop to some degree, but, you know, discussions about Moynihan's report, et cetera, but whether there was a focus anywhere on the man in the house rule and how it impacted, receipt of welfare benefits specifically. In other words, as soon as there was a man present in the household of an African-American woman, there was an expectation. What it did is it kind of fortified the theme. I think Perry referred to it as a economic essentialism, because welfare would look at it that as long as a man, whether he was present, and whether he was the father of the children involved, his presence negated their availability or eligibility for getting benefits from the program.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you make an excellent point. This is why, the Moynihan report, although it's groundbreaking, is a bit problematic in the sense that a lot of the research that he conducted really centered on middle class values. And a lot of the studies that he relied on are studies that really analyze like white families. And I would say if he really engage with researching and talking with actually urban families, he would have found maybe some of those cases that, well, if his father is in the home, it causes a disruption in terms of benefits. And many times these communities would have to hide the father's involvement so that they can get the necessary provisions. And it's not because these fathers were deadbeat. We're talking about in 1965, the average minimum wage was $1.25. And so if you are a man of color and you're unable to provide for your family, you're hurting them by your actual presence within the household. So those are some things that the Moynihan report, failed to recognize. And again, this is 1965, but the sad part is some of that same reasoning and thinking persists today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Order, for your response. Any other responses to that point, that question, or are there any additional questions that we have from the attendees? I don't see any other questions. Well, I don't see any additional questions. Thank you again for all those that are placing in the chat. Excellent presentation. Dr. Adolf just shared Dr. MacArthur's name based on the information he's just shared with us. If there aren't any other questions, I want to just thank the panelists for enlightening us today and bringing an awareness that a lot of us may not have. I think it was like 83% of us felt like you've enlightened us on the media portrayals of Black fathers. And so we thank you for your time and your commitment and your craft. And so we appreciate you being here. I want to thank every attendee for spending the last hour and 52 minutes with us. And your wonderful engagement within the chat. Please continue to look out for additional information about a part 2 of this series as we all go back to the drawing board and look at what we need to include in our part 2. Again, I want to thank Fathers Incorporated for this platform. I want to thank Ken Braswell for allowing for us to be able to have this healthy dialogue and to be able to help change the narrative of Black fathers in our community. So thanks again for everybody joining us. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Enjoy your day and enjoy your remainder of your month. So happy Martin Luther King Day to everybody.